17, yeah. We finished in chapter 16. God says, I'm done with judgments, and those are my words. I'm paraphrasing what he said. But now we're going to see the result of those judgments when we get into chapter 17 and 18, actually through 19 and 20. But as we begin chapter 17, I want to remind you that last week I mentioned to you the phrase great city is used several times in the book of Revelation, and there's scholars out there that say, well, it means Jerusalem. At times it does, and others say, no, it's talking about Babylon. At times it does. And some of them say, well, what about Rome? At times it does. So it means all three of them, and I told you that it probably means that the Antichrist will serve, or rule, I should say, from each one of those cities at various parts. But when we get into Revelation chapter 21, verse 10, we will see that the final great city is Jerusalem. And so I didn't want us to be confused about that, because it is not confusing. God knows what he wants us to know, and that is that all three of these cities have something to do with the tribulation period. When we look at chapter 17, God is telling us about detail regarding his judgment against Babylon. I have preachers from time to time say, well, Babylon was destroyed during the Iraq War. Well, no, what was destroyed during the Iraq War is what Saddam Hussein built as Babylon. Now, was it built on the original locations? Possibly. We don't know that for certain. Will it be rebuilt? Probably, but we don't know that for certain. Could it just be a symbolic description of what God's going to be dealing with? That's a possibility also. But back in chapter 13, we were introduced to the beast out of the sea. And the sea describes humanity as a whole. And so this beast come up out of humanity as a whole. We have been saying for decades, we have been speculating on who the Antichrist was. Back when Obama was president, there were those that said that he must be the Antichrist because he's Muslim. I'm convinced he was. He's Muslim, and he's probably the Antichrist, but we don't know that. Then even dating back into the 70s, there was a conviction among independent fundamental Baptists that it was going to be the Pope. We don't know that either. What we do know is that he's going to come out of mankind. He could be alive today. God could be preparing him. Would God prepare the Antichrist? He's allowing him powers that'll go beyond any other leader. That's how he'll be able to lead the entire world, is with these powers, because Satan gives him the powers that God has allowed Satan to retain. In chapter 13, then, we move on from there, and we see that God points out two different systems here to us. One is the religious system, and the other is the political system. The political system is what we're going to probably talk about first, and that is most likely it's going to be Babylon. My own personal opinion is that I believe that Babylon will be rebuilt. Just like the temple is going to have to be rebuilt in order to see what we're going to read about when we get to about chapter 20. And so, what would it take to rebuild the city of Babylon? Maybe a year's worth of work, depending on how much effort they put into it. But then there's also the beast out of the earth. The earth describes similarity to the sea, that this is a live individual too, but I pointed out to you that he was pictured to us as having two horns, meaning that he has two personalities, if I can say it that way. The first personality is that he's going to be dedicated to serving the Antichrist. The second personality is that he's probably a Jew. He's probably a Jew. So that indicates the two-horn representation. some scholars believe that he will position himself, he's the false prophet. We'll see that he's referred to that specifically here shortly. But some scholars say that he will most likely set up his ministry initially in Babylon, which leads to further evidence that Babylon will probably be rebuilt. But here in this chapter, we're going to see a close-up of the fall of the religious system, the fall of the false prophet. And the Antichrist then will take over the entire world. So what we're going to see that's not really voiced per se, but the picture is there for us, is that the Antichrist has been allowing this all along in order for him to create a scenario where he could step in and take over and control the whole world. And I emphasized when we were back in chapter 16 that Babylon symbolizes both of these, this religious system as well as the political system. But God, having said that, God deals with them separately. The political system was introduced to us in will be introduced to us, I should say, in more detail in chapter 18, but here in chapter 17, we're going to look at this religious system. It represents an immoral and worldly world, if I can say it that way. Does that sound familiar today? We have an immoral and worldly world today. Now, what makes a worldly world? A world that is concerned about me. Concerned about me. I see that even in churches. I've often used the example, we haven't done it here since BC, before COVID. Pat and I would often leave somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning and head out to the church we were going to be on Sunday morning. And it would be very rare that I did not see boats traveling up and down the freeways going to the lake on Sunday mornings. That is a picture of a worldly world, according to Revelation. Somebody's more concerned about pleasing themselves than they are about pleasing God. And so this is what we're going to see emphasized over and over and over again to us here. This religious system then dates back to Genesis chapter 10 and Genesis chapter 11, which introduces us to the Tower of Babel. I thought it was interesting when we lived in Germany for 6 years, our missionary pastor that we helped him start Bible Baptist Church in Munich, which is still there of over 40 years now. He took us, Pat and I, out to dinner at the Olympic Tower, which I think it was in 1972, Munich was hosting the Olympics there. And they had built a huge tower, and they built it around the belief of the construction of the Tower of Babel. And when you go in the foyer and the lower floor, you take an elevator all the way up to the top and so forth, and it's a beautiful view of the city. And it was a very pleasant evening with the Falk family. But I was looking at the pictures, and of course it was in German, and I was having to ask the pastor to translate it for me, and he said that the words were this. He says, man must continue to push his limits to succeed. Now, if you put that into perspective, this was during the Olympics. So the builder of that, though he was copying what was believed to be the Tower of Babel, he was making reference to the Olympians, the athletes, that if they wanted to succeed, they had to push themselves. If you've ever had anything to do with athletics, you know you got to push yourself. And I can remember back in junior high school, I was on the wrestling team at actually Bowed Story over here in Dallas. We were there for 1 year. And I never lost a bout, but I got beat up in the process of it because I was not on the offense. I was a defensive wrestler. And our coach told me time and time again, he said, Don, he said, if you would just go after these guys, he said, you'd end this in about a minute. And that's not me. You know, I didn't want to hurt anybody. I wanted to beat them, but I didn't want to hurt them. And so I'd let them come at me. I was stronger most of the time of the people that they put me up against, and I would manage to pin them. And he told me, he said, if you want to succeed at this, he says, you have to push yourself and push yourself and push yourself. And now fast forward to high school, I ran cross country. Same message from the coach there. At that time we were out in Southern California. Said, you got to push yourself, you got to push yourself. So that phrasing was referencing to the Olympians, but I don't know if the architect that designed this realized that the phrase also has an application to Nimrod, because it was all about him. It was all about him. You go back to Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, it says, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us, did I say us? A name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So what was it about? It was about Nimrod and the people. He wanted, man, we got to do this for us. For us. That's a worldly world. And that's what God has cautioned us about. Going all the way through the New Testament, he cautions us about that. Now we get to the last book of the Bible in Revelation. It is going to separate those that are immoral from those that are still following Christ, that are still living at that particular time. So their efforts were again about let us rather than let God. The Babylonian religious system consisted of an occultism. It consisted of sorcery. It consisted of astrology. If you go back and read some of the secular history surrounding this, and we don't know, again, it's one of those things we don't know. Some of it dates back to about the 1300s that they supposedly have managed to maintain, that was written about Nimrod, that he was what we might call today an astrologist. I think it's interesting that though we don't have any other than the New York Times and Washington Post, we don't have any major newspapers today, since social media has taken over and since most of our mainstream media is turned into talk shows. We don't have very few major newspapers. We do have the Dallas Morning News that's still there. But every single one of those papers, to include even the Ennis News, has an astrological report that you can I can hear me going in and out, and you're probably hearing me too. You can look up, if he was born on this day, this is what the stars are telling you. Don't go out because it's going to rain on you, that type of thing. Well, Nimrod was into this. He wasn't into God. He was into whatever it took to please them, People from all income levels today worship something. They worship something. Somebody made a big joke about it, but if you can access it, you can go back, and if you want to take the time to look it up, you can access the open court cases of the Civil Liberties Union. And if my memory is correct, and those that have told me and showed me that there was one time, it's been probably a decade or so ago, a group of atheists filed lawsuit that there was no religious holiday for them. There was a religious holiday for Christians, there was a religious holiday for the Jews, there's even a religious holidays for the Islam, but there's nothing for them. Well, a judge threw it out of court because he says, you yourself have claimed you're not religious. So why would we get you a religious holiday? But it gets back to the worldly world that we have seen evolve over the last decades here in our United States of America in particular, what we're familiar with, but it's not just us, it's around the world. Man has insisted for generations that we got to go all the way back to Adam and Cain and Abel. God said, I want you to bring a sacrifice to me, and it needs to be a blood sacrifice. But Cain had a better idea. He says, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do it my way. Well, that's the way mankind is today. When you look at all the different denominations out there today, you look at all the mega churches out there today, what do we see? We see mankind doing what mankind wants to do instead of what God wants us to do. And, you know, I know I'm going to step on somebody's toes when I say this, but numbers in a church do not reflect that you're doing it right. It just reflects that you're pleasing the people. You know, Billy Bob's over there, they can have a concert and they can pack the house out. That doesn't mean they're doing it right. So the Babylonian system, therefore, was based on two things. First, it was based on world religious system that denies the deity and the authority of Christ. Number two, it was a world political federation, if I can describe it that way, that denies the right of Christ's reign over the world. We go back, well, let's look at the first one. It denies the authority and the deity of Christ. What does John 14:6 says? In the words of Christ, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. It is a federation that denies the right of Christ's reign over the world. You go to John chapter 1, verses 9 through 13, it says that Christ is, and I'm paraphrasing, he is the light of the world and the creator of the world. You go back to John chapter 1 and read the whole chapter 1, you'll find out that Christ created all that was created. Now we get to verse 1. And there came one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. I asked a pastor one time, and we were just talking, and the way he was describing, he said, I'm getting ready to teach Revelation. And I encouraged him. I said, well, you need to do some studying, because there's a lot of word emphasis, there's a lot of analogies, there's a lot of pictures, and you need to make sure that you understand them, and you have to go back to the Greek a lot and make sure that you understand it. At times you got to go back to the Old Testament and look at the prophets and piece it all together. And he said, yeah, he said, the one that really interested me is that great whore. He says that I've always been convinced that is the greatest sin in America is prostitution. I looked at him for a moment to see if he was serious or not, and I said, well, the term whore is used, yes, but it's talking about unfaithfulness. It's not talking about prostitution as you think of, prostitution of a woman. And the picture is there of adultery, of whoredom, but the whole context is that this great whore is going to be adulterous against God, going to be unfaithful against God. And the word is used here is to describe a counterfeit religion. If we want to take the time and go back to Isaiah chapter 1, Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 16, we would see that both of those prophets talked about this. Spiritual wisdom is often, or I shouldn't say spiritual wisdom, spiritual whoredom is often referred to, particularly down through the minor prophets. In Nahum chapter 3 and verse 4, it says this, because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her whoredoms, talking about a system, and families through her witchcrafts. Then we get over to James chapter 4, verse 4. You adulterers and adulteresses, know you not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is an enemy with God. So as much as I enjoy living, particularly in the state of Texas, and living in the United States of America, God says be careful. Be careful about what you love about this world. We need to be careful. I'm just grateful that Tex-Mex is not on God's list of things of don't do, because I enjoy Tex-Mex. And I learned that when you get outside of the South, you get outside of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and Southern California, even get up to Northern California. We were in Washington State, Pat and I, here a couple of years ago, and the pastor says, "Oh, I got to take you to this Mexican restaurant. It is just absolutely wonderful." Might have been wonderful to him, but it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't Tex-Mex. So Pat and I looked at each other and says, from this point forward, we're not going to eat Mexican food once we get out of the southern part of the United States, because it ain't the same. It may have the same name on it, it may have even the same people, but they do it to please the people that are there, just as the Tex-Mex restaurants down here do it to please us, because it's what we're accustomed to. But I use that as an illustration that what we're seeing here is this spiritual whoredom is people doing what they want to do instead of what God wants us to do. So the whore, therefore, is this worldwide church system that is against God. It's Satan's counterfeit religion. It's an imitation of the true church. The phrase "who sits on many waters" refers to the control this system is going to have over the world. We'll see this more detailed when we get to verse 15. So we see this idolatrous church in control of the people of the world and dominating the political system even. And it's setting, my thoughts are, this is kind of what sets the Antichrist up, of realizing that, hey, I gotta remove this if I'm going to control the whole world. Or otherwise, this is going to control the whole world. Historically here, what we see is repeated for us. Since the World Council of Churches, there's been pastors, even independent fundamental Baptist pastors, that have stood up and said, well, the rapture's already happened, because we've already got the World Council of Churches there to prove it. No, we got the beginning of this religious system that's going to exist, this World Council of Churches that's going to exist during the tribulation period, but we don't have, that's no proof that the rapture has occurred. We look at verses 2 through 7. It says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. This begins to explain the term whore here is the unfaithfulness that these people have had. And it goes on to say, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. This is now John is saying this angel carried me away. And I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet in color, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Verse 6, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. We'll come back to that in a moment. And the angel said unto me, wherefore didst thou marvel? The mystery of the woman and the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Now, before we go any, John says here, I wondered with great admiration. What he is talking about here is the word admiration has multiple meanings, just like a lot of our words have multiple meanings. What it means is that John was seeing something he had never seen before. He was looking at something that just astonished him, took his breath away. It was not that he was so pleased with it. He'd go so far as to say he was terrified with it. It was something that he hadn't seen before. So we need to remember the emphasis here in these verses is on the prostitute religion, which will be Christless. And we go back to Peter, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2, and this is another verse. It's careful. We need to be careful to follow the grammar. In verse number 1 it says, but there were false prophets also among the people. If we go back and keep the whole thing in context, Peter is talking about a time in the future. He says there was a time in the future when there were false prophets. The reason why we know that is the next phrase. It says, even as there shall be false teachers among you. Now he comes back to the present time, Peter's present time. He's saying there's going to be a time in the future when there's going to be false prophets, just as we have false teachers here today back in Peter's day. We have false prophets and false teachers today, scattered all over the United States, that are in pulpits today. And that's what Peter is telling us. Who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them. In other words, that paid the penalty on the cross for them. And bring upon themselves swift destruction, and many shall follow their pernicious, however you want to say it, ways. That word means harmful, dangerous, damaging. Ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. So to understand how a single religion can manage to unite all the kings of the earth is under its leadership. And you put the false prophet here. He has the same similar, if not the same powers that God has allowed Satan to retain all of these generations. Then the people. We're described as people that like sheep. What do sheep do? Sheep follow. They don't lead. They follow. They follow a shepherd. Somebody gets out in the middle of them and says, come on, follow me. They'll follow them. I don't know how many times growing up as a kid, I saw this illustration. This was back when you could have something religious taught in schools. We would have, usually our coach would come to us and he says, come on guys, follow me. You'd have 2 or 3 jump up, man, they're willing to follow him. And then you'd have 2 or 3 that step back. And he says, you know who's right and who's wrong? He says, you guys that have stepped back, because you don't know where I'm going to lead you. And he says, that's the way the world is going today. The people are just like sheep. They're ready to follow anybody that stands up and says, I've got the way, follow me. Now, I'm not, if I might sound like I'm getting political here, I don't care what side of the fence you fall on, whether you fall on the red side or the blue side. Every president that has ever been in office has said that, I'm here, follow me. Every president has got up there and said, I am going to be the president for all the people. And then they go and do what they want to do. I don't care what side of the fence you're on. Now, it just so happens that most of us probably lean on the conservative side, because the conservative side supports the right to lie. Particularly, that issue is probably more prominent today than separation of church and state, and even the sanctity of marriage, which also is under attack today. When we look at what is happening in the world today, those that lean on that is where we ought to lean. We can tolerate the rest of it. We can vote against the rest of it. But if we need to focus on those that think that the baby is just some sort of fetus, bunch of cells and so forth and so on, and they refuse to accept the fact that it is a human being, they're wrong. And God will deal with that. He'll deal with that someday, somehow, some way. Maybe during the tribulation period. I kind of think that he's probably going to deal with it leading into the tribulation period, just the final days perhaps before the rapture occurs. The system pictured in verse 5 here, it says, upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon, the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, shows that these followers were idolatrous, meaning they were unfaithful. They were lustful, meaning that they were uncontrollable. They were also immoral. You know, we could go on describing them. So the religion of Babylon for thousands of years has fascinated the non-believer, but there's been a lot of Christians that have been, if I can use this Texas slang, sucked into this ideology as well. And it's wrong. So the mystery of the woman in verse 7 is that the false religion is going to be based on some depraved occultic practices. Now, I can tell you Satan's real. He's real. Going back some 40-some-odd years ago, I was asked by our pastor. We had a man, let me go back to the beginning. I was involved with the youth. I had a young man that came and he got saved, and I had an opportunity to deal with him at the altar, and he wept, you know, down there on the altar, and I believed that it was real to him. He said, I want to follow the Lord. I want to be what God wants me to be. He was about 16 years old, and he said, will you help me save my dad? I said, well, son, we can't save your dad. Only Christ can save your dad. But if you get him here, we can make sure that he hears the gospel. Well, that next service time, he had his dad there. When it came invitation time, he drug his dad down to the altar. And his dad was kind of teary-eyed, and I had the opportunity to deal with his dad and show him how to be saved, and he got saved. And a short while later, he came to the pastor, and he said, I haven't been to church in a while. He said, because I'm having these health issues. And he said, I don't know how to explain it other than the fact that I'm being treated for, I forget what the term of it was, but we might think of it as acute allergic reactions. He says, every time I go into my home, he says, I just immediately, as soon as I walk through the door, I have this horrendous headache. And he said, it just almost blinds me. I can't walk, I can't function, I just basically, I'm out of it. And he says, I can walk outside, and immediately it clears up. He says they've come in and they've checked for gas leaks, they've checked for this, they've checked for that, and on and on and on. And right now they're looking at the possibility of moving us to different quarters. And he's telling all of this, explaining it all to his pastors. And we had 2 deacons. I was one of them. I was the chairman of the deacons. There was 2 of us. And the pastor called us in, and he explained all this to us. And I said, well, how can we help him other than pray for him? He says, we go to his house. And he says, we'll have, you might call it an exorcism. He said, I don't know I'd go that far, but we're going to go over there, and we're going to pray them demons out of there. I said, how do we know there's demons in there? He says, that's my guess, really. But he said, we'll know when we get there. So we get to this guy's house. It's a 2-story, kind of like a townhouse. And there was, like I said, I think there was 3 of us. And the 2 of them, no, there's 4 of us. There was another man that came over there with us. And the pastor said, Don, I want you to stay here in the living room. And he sent this other man back in the bedrooms in the lower floor, and he says, this other 2, we went upstairs. And he says, we're going to all close our eyes and we're going to pray. And he says, if this is what I think it is. Now, this is a missionary that had been on the field for about 25 years, and he had been in the middle of sorcery. He had been in the middle of witchcraft. So he had experienced witchcraft. He had experienced sorcery. So he wasn't just wildly guessing. He was basing it on his own experience, that this is what this man was facing. So everybody went to their place, and he was talking real loud, and he said, okay, close your eyes, and whatever you do, don't open your eyes. Just keep praying. And he said, Don, I want you to go over to the mantle. They had like a false fireplace in there, and I went over, and I put my hands on the mantle, and I started praying, and I jerked my hands back as like I stuck them in a freezer. So I just stood there, and I crossed my hands. I kept my eyes closed, and I prayed. We started hearing noises, doors slamming, and windows going up and down, and started hearing hollering and yelling and everything else. And he says, don't open your eyes, just keep praying. And we kept praying. And it was like somebody had a handle on the volume, and started turning the volume down little by little by little by little until it was silent. And he says, just a short while more. We kept praying. And then finally he says, I'm going to pray out loud. And he prayed, and he said, Lord, I pray that you keep these demons out of this house. I pray that you'll keep your hands around this family. And he went on and prayed. And I'm sitting there, and I was shaking inside. And the pastor came back down, and he talked to us, and he said, I'm pretty sure that's the first time any of you have ever experienced this. And he said, my prayer is you never have to experience it again. I told him, I said, you got that right. Be okay with me if I never go through it again. He says, now, a warning. He says, when you go home tonight, he says, you're not going to sleep. He says, you're not going to sleep. He says, Satan's going to do everything he can. Try to get in your head. So I went home, and I didn't tell Pat a lot about this. She's heard me use it as an illustration many times over the years. But I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was tired, but every time I closed my eyes, I started replaying all of that again and again and again. But what I do know is that next day, that man went back to his house, and he never had a headache again. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in all of that. All I know is that God allowed that to happen for a reason. If nothing else, to convince me, Satan's real. His power is real. He will have even more power than what we can imagine during the tribulation period. So when we read about all of this, don't read it like you're reading a book of fiction. Don't read it like you're reading a myth, which a lot of people out there would like for you to think. That's what Satan wants you to do. Yeah, I just read it like it's a myth. No, it's not a myth. It is going to happen just as God describes it to happen. Now, where is it going to happen? For at least in my knowledge, for 50 years, we have said that it's going to happen and begin in Rome. Because most of the scholars over the years have said, well, there's no other religious organization that has more money than the Catholic Church. 50 years ago, that's probably true. Today, the Catholic Church, according to my research, is worth $30 billion. Say, well, that's that's a lot of money. But my argument is that if you're going to base that on that premise, that it's just how wealthy that religion is, and that's not the only wealthy religion in the world. The Mormons are worth $100 billion. Islam is worth $70 billion. So let that sink in. Maybe it's going to be a combination of all of these. You put them all together, and you got $100 billion, $170, $200 billion that is going to fund this religious system during the time of the Antichrist. There's not going to be a shortage of money. There's not going to be a shortage of property. In fact, Satan, the Antichrist, will have your property, have my property, have our house. He's going to get my truck. That's going to upset me. He's going to get Mark's midlife crisis sports car. Well, you better wrap your arms around it and hope it goes up with you in the rapture. My whole emphasis in all of this, and I don't want to get it so serious that we go home and don't sleep tonight, but I want us to realize that God gave us this detail. He gave us this description for a reason, and that reason is to not let the world suck us into the belief that this is all a myth, because it's not. It's not. Like the church at Laodicea, she thought she was rich, and that took care of it. But Christ, in the words of Christ, we go back to Revelation chapter 3, verse 17. There's a verse that jumps out there that says, the wretched, the pitiful, the poor, the blind, and the naked. We're either going to side on the side of the world or we're going to side on the side of God. I don't know about you, but I want to be on God's side. I want to be following Him. I want to be on His path. And as much as I said, enjoy living in Texas and enjoy being a citizen of the United States. We got the greatest country in the world in spite of all of our problems, in spite of all of our failures. It's still greater than any other nation. But if we have the number of Christians in this United States that we think we have, you take us all out of the world, this United States of America is going to implode on itself, and the Antichrist will suck it up in a heartbeat. Verse 6, it says, I saw the woman drunken with the blood of saints and with the blood of martyrs of Jesus when I saw her. That again tells us that there's going to be those that will be saved during that period, that they're going to be martyred immediately almost, unless they're managed to hide somewhere. Great admiration again means the display was just, again, beyond anything that John had ever seen. He didn't know how to describe it even. We see the need for this in 1 John 2:15 when we read, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So verse 3 refers to the Antichrist and his kingdom and the revived Roman Empire. We see this woman sitting on the beast, indicating this is the first part of the tribulation, and the false religion is going to enjoy a position and power that's going to be beyond anything we've ever seen. And it will have influence over the revived Roman Empire. We're going to stop there. Stop there and go into verse 8. Next week says the beast that saw, well, it won't be next week, and I'll explain that in a moment. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and is yet is. So it gets interesting from that point forward. Say I won't be here next week. I might be here, but we had planned, Brother Mark and I and the boys, to go to Gulfport. Going to try to do two things at once, to pick up some Bibles, and then also let the boys attend part of the youth conference that they've gone to every year for many years. And I got a message